Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, for this May 16th edition of the show. Happy birthday, Sean Haney. Wish you were here. Mostly so I could sing to you and embarrass you entirely. All right, thanks for joining us tonight. It is pouring rain where I am here in Eastern Ontario. Hey, Kevin, Canadian Cowman's here. I was wondering where everybody was. I think John maybe is having a couch nap with this rain. Let us know maybe what the weather is like in your area. This rain, I know for Eastern Ontario here, is much needed, very welcome. A lot of crop went in the ground this past week, and it's a pretty nice warm rain, so we will take it. Okay, so of course, a few housekeeping items before we get rolling with tonight's show. If you do need some CEU credits, you can qualify for them just for following along and letting us know you watch the program. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists at tomorrow morning ish. Well, you should have the show up and you can let us know that you watched it. So please do that. And of course, a big thank you to our show sponsors. We have the Real Ag Radio that goes Monday to Friday. And actually, one of our guests, Wheat Pete here tonight, was on today's show. Wow, he's earning his keep this week. That was just a couple hours ago. He was live on the show. And Pest and Predators podcast, a new episode comes out tomorrow. You will not want to miss this. There is a discussion about aphid milkshakes, and that's all I'm going to say, because you got to go check it out. So that'll be on realagriculture.com tomorrow, as well as YouTube and, of course, our podcast stream. And then, of course, Adama Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today. Okay, so John is here. That's wonderful. And hello to Ray. Ray is here as well. We've already got our first question, so everyone is ready to rock and roll. So let's bring in the guests. Nobody wants to hear me. They're here to hear from Warren Ward with the Canola Council of Canada and Peter Johnson with Real Agriculture. Warren, hailing from Eastern Saskatchewan. Warren, how much crop is in the ground around where you are?
Right now, not much of anything, actually. It's been pretty slow this spring.
Eesh, that's a little okay. So Peter, you grimace. Um, I almost feel bad now with how much crop Ontario has in. How have we done
So,
this week, Pete?
so we we had just an amazing week. Like the poor fertilizer suppliers simply could not keep up. I talked to one grower, he called in 4 days before they'd have a spreader available. He was going to spread it himself. They didn't even need a man, but that's how busy things were. They
Mhm.
just go. I think a comment was we went from zero back about a week ago today, or somewhere in
Mhm.
that range, maybe Saturday. We went from zero to, I don't know, 150 miles an hour or 250 miles an hour,
Pretty much.
just flat out. Now, be careful,
Yeah.
Lyndsey, not on the heavy clays. The heavy
Yes.
clays, some of those, they were just nicely getting going. It's what really helped, even on the heavy clays, was the heat and the drying
Mm.
index. Like we had drying index that were in the excellent category for about 4 days in a row. And we, you mentioned this rain is incredibly important. Oh my gosh. We actually had growers who were quite convinced we were into a 1988 drought to begin the spring.
That's all it
In
took.
19
It was a
in
week.
19 Yeah, well, but it was a dry forecast,
It
and
it
those high.
was
Anyway, like that, it didn't rain till July 17th in 1988. That
right.
was when we got
Yeah.
the first rain, and so we were planting deeper, we were rolling things, and yeah, we got a ton done in areas where 90-95% corn and probably over 50 or 60% of the soybeans in the ground. And on the heavy
Mhm.
clays were much less than that, but
Yeah.
wow, things just flying.
Yeah. So Warren, in your area, is it just a late start? You just don't have the warmth to dry things out and get things going, or excessive moisture, or what's the holdback where you are?
It's been a little bit of a combination of everything. It started off with a really cold spring, right? We were really about a month behind in terms of seeing snowfall or snowbanks disappear. In fact, I was just out
Mhm.
late last week down one of those little trails, and I thought I'd have no problem, but I actually had to back up and turn around because there was still a snowbank across it there deep in the bush. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
part of
Yeah.
been part of the problem. And then we have had a little bit of rainfall over the last week or so here as well. So it has slowed things down a little
Mhm.
bit. I don't think too many people are disappointed about the rain, but we do realize the calendar date and would like to be out there a
Yeah.
little bit, seeing some activity by now.
Yeah, absolutely. Now so tonight's topic, of course, we are going to talk starter fertility. We're also going to talk early nutrition, of course, because these things are also sort of kind of melding together this year, exactly because of what you're talking about, Warren. We've got farmers who are going to have to push this seeding window pretty hard and might have to make some sacrifices. And I saw today or yesterday, I think Calvin, my coworker Calvin, shared a tweet out of Manitoba where they are, you know, broadcasting the canola seed on and going to work it in with a harrow. Doesn't leave a lot of options for fertility at that point. And now, are you going to grimace when you hear that? Like as a canola agronomist, do you sort of want to plug your ears and say, "Dear Lord, no, don't do it," or can that be successful to broadcast it on and sort of just work it in?
So it can be successful. It has been in the past. It you have to look at it as a last resort, though. And if we're at the end of May and fields are still too wet to get the seeder out there, yeah, I think it becomes a viable option at that point. But you have to go into it with a good plan, and fertility is key to that
Mhm.
plan, as you mentioned. Also, trying to get good seed to soil contact, just so you can have those seeds that you're sprinkling on the surface actually germinate and grow. And that can be a challenge too. So you got to think about, what is the field situation that you're going into? What's the crop residue? What is the background nutrient level, and
Mhm.
what can you do to optimize the growth of those plants?
Mhm.
Ah,
Absolutely.
canola's a weed anyway. It's going to grow. Just get over it.
Oh, Peter. All
Except when
right.
I tried
Well,
seeding some in a pop bottle for my daughter's sixth grade science experiment.
and then it didn't work, and then you're like, "Come on.
I think we got a
Don't
little
let me
ambitious with
down."
the water.
Yeah, that'll happen. Little seedling rot happening there. All right, a few shout outs quickly. We've got Ivan here from Mexico, so that's super great to see someone from Mexico. Warren Schneckenberger has joined us and says, finally, a Warren on the panel. So Warren, meet Warren. He's very glad to see you. And yes, we had quite the storm. I think Warren farms east and a bit south of where I am. I think that they've got some much more wicked storms over the past 24 hours than we've got. And that has definitely held some farmers up, maybe from some spray passes and stopped the planting. That's all right. And Kevin, of course, out in BC, Canadian Cowman says, can barely get 36 hours of dry to be able to cut silage. My brain and the whole cutting silage thing on May 16th still doesn't quite compute. But I gotta tell you, with this heat and this moisture, my hay crop is coming pretty quick. So there is also that. Now, to that point, and goat farmers from the Philippines. This is an international festival. All right. Pete, I did want to, you've made fun of canola, so now let's pick on wheat. We did, we've got we've got an okay, I'm gonna tell you, it's not a great looking wheat crop across Ontario. There are some areas with some very nice wheat, but wheat is not a warm season crop, doesn't love 30 degrees. Are we at a critical stage that this heat wave could have damaged the yield potential? What do we think?
Yeah, so it, we aren't damaging the yield potential at this growth stage the way we would if it was during grain fill. That's when it's really critical. But to get highest wheat yields, we need maximum growth rate from growth stage 30 or 31. So from first node right
Mhm.
through, till 10 or 20 days after anthesis, right through the bulk of the grain fill period. And anytime it's over 25 degrees Celsius, the wheat crop actually it can't keep up. And so you're actually not at maximum photosynthetic rate, or you're not at maximum growth when you're over 25 degrees Celsius. So it's not hurting us as much as it would during grain fill because we're not yet filling the grain, but we'd like to make big biomass, and high temperatures don't make big biomass. So it's not, we don't want them over 25 if we can avoid it, Lyndsey, but not as critical as it would be during grain fill.
All right. Well, and if I'm honest, our forecast is for like 14 degrees for the rest of the week. So it's going to be just fine. But I wanted to, at least try and put the fear into you. Schneckenberger says here 50 to 80 mils since Saturday. Remember last year, Warren, when you were like, I need it to rain? Well, it's raining now. It's just late, like
So,
really late.
but
Yeah.
Lyndsey, Warren's not alone in that.
No.
Up near Moorfield it was. So near
Mhm.
Moorfield, they got 3 inches, 75 millimeters in an hour, and they had worked ground
Ouch.
really fine and pounded it down
Mhm.
because we were having trouble making the seed bed, and the erosion.
Yeah.
Got sent a picture today over WhatsApp, and the erosion filled the ditch. Like the ditch was
Yeah.
right full of soil, and you just go, "Oh my gosh!"
Yeah.
So Warren,
Yeah.
that's too much rain. I agree, but
Yeah.
at least if it didn't all come in an hour and wash everything
Yeah.
away, that's a help.
And if you have a winter wheat crop that's growing, ta-da, it's using it. Or a hay crop, it's covering the ground, it's slowing down those raindrops. Now, Warren, of course, in your neck of the woods, there would be some zero till, lots of min till. Although when your side of the province gets a little too wet, I would imagine there's at least a little more tillage than maybe the western side of the province. Have you seen
Certainly,
a
yeah.
trend to more tillage in your area?
Not so far this year, and coming off a couple of really dry years, I think that's also helped reinforce the fact that we do lose a lot of moisture and we do increase erosion, and it isn't
Mhm.
necessarily the best practice around here. Which was a complete reversal from about 10 years ago when it was really wet, and I mean, yeah, like
Mhm.
there was ruts everywhere, people had to work, and there was a lot of cultivators being pulled out of the bush again. So it's a quite a mix here, but yeah, certainly not as much min or zero till as we do find in the more traditionally drier regions of the prairies.
Mhm. I lived in Saskatchewan 10 years ago, and I take some responsibility for all of that moisture, just so you know. I apologize. I'm pretty sure it was like the coldest summer on record the year I moved there. So
You should
I
maybe just
apologize.
come back once in a while when we need rain then.
Yeah, there you go. I'll like show up in July and August for just a couple
Like
days. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now let's dig in a little bit here into starter fertility. We do have a couple clips tonight. One about canola. Warren, though, I'm gonna start with you and focus on canola. And think about those very dry conditions. So, I mean, the prairies right now are an interesting sort of from one end to the other. I mean, southern Alberta is pretty much done seeding in a lot of ways. In Manitoba, and like yourself, I mean, Manitoba, I think last week it was less than 1% seeded, and the 5-year average is 21. So huge ground to make up. So we've got everything from potentially way too wet, and we talked about broadcast canola, all the way to that canola sitting in dry conditions completely. So let's maybe pick on dry conditions first. When it comes to starter fertility, what am I worried about in that super dry situation with canola?
Well, the number one worry is always going to be damaging that seed that you're placing. We know that moisture can forgive a lot of situations, right? It's the big equalizer. So in those drier conditions, we don't have that buffer, and really what's happening when we get seed too close or fertilizer too close to the seed or in the seed row, we can see that either salt effect causing damage or ammonia toxicity if it's a nitrogen containing product. So there's a lot of downside, I guess, to having too much of that seed placed fertilizer. We know, with canola, we like to see a little bit of phosphorus in there to get that early season vigor and pop up effect, and that's good. But even in those really dry conditions, you might want to think about, my safe maximum rate isn't necessarily always going to be the rate I want to use,
Mhm.
especially when it is this dry.
Mhm. Pete,
Yeah, and
you want to hop
I
in
think
here?
I think that's really critical because the fertilizer always takes the moisture first. We call it starter fertilizer, we call it pop-up fertilizer, but actually it slows down germination because the fertilizer takes the water first. So it takes the water, then the seed gets the water. It's all about the affinity for water that the different products have, the seed versus the
Mhm.
fertilizer. Well, by the time the seed germinates in dry conditions, you already have that high salt content there from that starter fertilizer, and so that germinating seed can really be damaged pretty easily. And so Warren's 100% right. Where you would normally say, "Oh gosh, I can easily do 100 pounds of MAP seed placed," on a dry year and on light soils in particular, you're probably half of that. And you really have to start looking at two things, I think. Number one, is my yield potential there to
Mm-hmm.
justify applying that much fertilizer? And number two, how dry is it, and how much does that increase my salt injury risk or my ammonia toxicity? Although putting urea close to the seed is always a bit of a high risk venture.
Mm-hmm. That's for people who really want to live on the edge, Pete. That's what that's
Yeah.
for. When, because when farming isn't enough of a gamble, let's do that. Now, okay, so but Warren, when so in that scenario where we may have to pull those rates back, um, let's say the rain begins and the yield potential is there. How do we make up what maybe we didn't get to put down? What's our best option?
Yeah, so that's always the challenge with cutting rates off, especially in those drier years. And I always like to plan for success. I mean, it's not too often that we go back to back years with extreme droughts like we've seen, and not have that yield potential. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But there's a couple things worth looking at. So I talked about starter fertilizer, so like your phosphorus or your seed place fertilizer. That's what's in the seed row. The rest of it's going outside the seed row, mostly because it's mobile nutrients, right? We're talking about our nitrogen and our sulfur, would be the big ones. Phosphorus, we want to keep that as close to the seed as possible at that safe rate. So we really get, in my mind, one chance to apply that phosphorus and do it right, and that's at seeding. But if we talk about the more mobile nutrients, like your nitrogen and your sulfurs, that if a person did decide to cut back their rates a little bit at seeding, we still have an opportunity to come back in crop and make up for that, especially if conditions went from dry to wet, or increased yield potential. So we can always keep that in mind as a strategy. And it's an interesting time right now, just with coming off the drought last year and the amount of residual nutrients that were left in
Mm-hmm.
some of these fields. And then the call it high fertilizer prices as well. So it's kind of that, and canola prices are doing really well too. So what do you do if the people that are really good with the spreadsheet probably have it worked out, and on paper it can look pretty good that there's still money to be made there, but there is also that risk, especially when we're starting out so dry. So I'm actually in those situations a fan of doing a little, or planning to do a little bit of top dressing if conditions do warrant it later on.
Mm-hmm. Pete, it's okay for canola prices to be where they are. I swear.
Well,
No,
I
I'm just
actually, Sean and I talked a little bit about this, and the problem with high prices is that they drive us to do just everything. And so on the wheat
Mm,
crop today, and Warren texted me this morning, Warren Schneckenberger, that's in the chat. He texted me this morning and said wheat was over $500 a ton for this fall's delivery at harvest.
yeah.
And you just go, so we want to get every bushel, because suddenly, wheat at
Mm-hmm.
$15 a bushel. Well, it used to be that if I got a 2 bushel yield bump from a fungicide, that didn't pay. Suddenly at
Mm-hmm.
$15, it does pay. And so we want to actually push harder with the high prices. Even though fertilizer's gone up, it just, the response still tends to pay for it. So we want to maximize that. And meanwhile, in the really dry conditions, as Warren says, you got to be really careful how much you put there. And I'm
Yeah.
100% in support of the split application. You're always smarter when you make a split application of nitrogen. I don't care if it's canola, it's wheat, or it's corn, any nitrogen needing crop. So that is one of the ways, nitrogen and sulfur, that you can
Mm-hmm.
manage those realities of dry weather, or of any adverse weather in the early growing
Right.
season.
There's the other
The
side too,
challenge
which
is
is what Manitoba is facing, which is too wet, right?
Yeah.
So go ahead, Warren. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the challenges of that top dress application are always there too, though. And we're talking about these drier regions right now, and they're typically are drier throughout the year. And what do we know about top dressing is that we need moisture to move those
Mm-hmm.
nutrients into the soil where the plants can use them, right? So it's a bit of that catch-22 that, it's not always a given that oh, it's rain in the forecast, we'll go and apply it now. Well, all of a sudden the weatherman was wrong and it doesn't rain. Now we've got nitrogen sitting on the surface there. And that's not an ideal situation either. So there are risks. The other thing too would just be the logistics of it. I mean, we know that top dressing season for canola, which is up to that 6 leaf stage, is a pretty busy time of year. And if someone's looking at top dressing with a liquid UAN application, the sprayer's pretty busy spraying weeds at that time. So if that is your plan, you really have to plan that you are going to be able to do that when the time comes.
So Warren, it's that early? It's 6 leaf? That's
yeah. So up to the
Wow.
6 leaf stage is when we need to see that nitrogen on to see maximum benefit of doing
That's
that.
amazing.
Beyond that,
Okay.
you might see some slight benefits, but really, because of, you look at when canola is using the most amount of nitrogen, it's through that stem elongation period and into flowering, and that's really when we're seeing that biomass really taking off.
That's a lot earlier than I anticipated. Pete, go ahead.
Well, but so I do think, though, that you can balance that a little bit, Warren, in terms of, you're right, that's when the high demand starts, but it isn't when you need 100% of the nitrogen. So if we put 65% of the nitrogen on up front, that would carry it partway through, and then you have a little wider window. It's the same thing with corn or with wheat. We all start early, and so and I think that's one of the things that you have to think about, Lyndsey, as we talk about this early season fertility management. Do not starve the crop for nitrogen in the early season, but that doesn't mean you need 100% of your nitrogen. You really can put a portion on and come back and top dress. And Warren, by the way, it's not just Western Canada where we have issues when we top dress. We had growers top dressing wheat last week with the second application, wondering if they would get enough moisture to move it into the soil and make it available, or if it would sit on the soil surface and be positionally unavailable for the rest of the year. It takes between 1/2 inch and 0.8 of an inch to move that nitrogen into the soil. So for most of Ontario, I think we've had enough, but not for all of Ontario. You get down around Dresden, and I don't think they've had that much. I'm not sure if they've had 0.2 of an inch yet. So that concern is everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I think we're 8:23, so I'm doing okay to get to a first clip. I'm going to try, but John did mention here, and it is one of the things, that Ontario is not a huge canola grower at all, but some great comments in the chat about seeing some canola fields in places they haven't necessarily seen them before, which is pretty interesting to see, that the variety or the hybrids are changing. I am lucky because I live relatively close to Renfrew, and there's still canola that goes in there. So that makes me happy because I get to see my yellow flowers every once in a while. I envision if anyone has ever walked through a potting canola crop, that's when I envision you try to put nitrogen on, and it's just a mat of rubbery cabbage plants, and there's no way you're getting anything in that canopy or anywhere near the soil. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it is that early, because that's when it frankly is even possible to get anything down into the soil at that point. So yeah, okay. So this question of nitrogen, though, Pete, it segues nicely into this clip. So this is just from last year. This is Jack Payne. This is a canola school. And one of the questions he asked, this is just a couple minutes, is figuring out your coefficient. What is your how many pounds of N for your bushel of yield? Because this, of course, is going to drive so many decisions. So producer Jay, if we could go to that clip.
Right now, at this point, with canola prices where they are, a lot of growers want to try and hit those optimum yields that they're looking for. They don't want to be short on groceries. So what you're looking for nitrogen, of course, standard recommendation has been to use 2.75 to 3.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of yield. Again, there's no one number, because it depends on your situation, depends on your soil, depends on your area in terms of moisture. So what coefficient you use really comes from experience. So there is no one number that you can use for your nitrogen rate. You're going to have to come up with something that is based on your own experience and maybe from your agronomist. So when we're looking at nitrogen, let's say we're using, let's say, an application of 40 to 60 pounds. That first 40 to 60 pounds of application is going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, or the best return, because it's on that initial part of the yield response curve where it's the steepest. So you're going to get better response out of that first 40 to 60 pounds. Then as you start getting up on the curve, so a grower may say, well, I'm going to add 80 pounds, I'll add another 20 pounds. That's starting to get on maybe where the part of the curve where it starts to flatten out, so you're not getting the same response in terms of bang for your buck as you do on that first 40 to 60. So it's similar to phosphate. Those first increments can be hugely important and give you the best response.
So what are some of the things you're going to want to consider when it comes to sulfur, especially when it comes to risk of toxicity in the seed row?
Well, we're always looking at, okay, sulfur is very important. I mean, I don't know any canola grower that doesn't put sulfur down with their canola. So it's very important that we look at sulfur. I guess, first of all, is coming with a recommendation. One of the standby recommendations that I've always used came from Ross McKenzie, and Ross always said, if you've got 15 pounds or less in that top 6 inches, you're going to apply sulfur regardless of what's in the second depth, because we don't want that crop to go short on sulfur until, waiting for the roots to get down to it. So that's always important. So again, now your application rate, again, depends on your target yield, depends on if you're shooting for a 45 bushel crop or a 75 bushel crop, but typically you're going to be somewhere between that 15 to 25 pounds per acre of sulfur. When we look at sulfur application, especially if it's going close to the seed, we want to back off on the ammonium sulfate, because again, we're going to run up to salt effects. So a lot of products that have a mixture of elemental and ammonium sulfate are good. A lot of the newer sulfur products that are elemental are smaller particle size, so they oxidize quicker. So those are good options, because you're not running into the toxicity risks with application with those products.
Oh, the quad track. Okay, anyway. I'm trying to wonder. I think that's all Kara's B-roll. Anyway, okay, so a couple things, squirrel, a couple things in that video. Let's talk. Warren, do you have an N coefficient that you like to use? Or is it very personal and you're not going to share? Because
Yeah, sorry, I can't go there. Yeah, no.
Yeah, okay.
I tend to keep it as a pretty broad range when I'm talking about that. I go anywhere from 2.5 to 3 pounds per bushel of canola usually. And it's interesting, actually, I was just crunching some numbers the other day, and I think it was from 2020, and the data I had for across Western Canada worked out to 2.83 pounds per bushel of canola. So that was from some survey results. So I thought that was a pretty average number to be using.
Okay. Pete?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that really struck me in that clip was, so the first 40 to 60 pounds, and we're basically, just for easy math, let's call it 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So at 60 pounds, I'm fertilizing for a 20 bushel canola crop. And it's like, no, I'm not fertilizing. So the soil residual N is something that wasn't mentioned in that particular clip. And I really think for Western Canada, man, and given the drought you had last year, and in some cases the residual nitrogen that you had from the drought last year, that should have carried forward. Now, the big question in, Warren's part of the world, or in the super wet part of Manitoba, is how much of that nitrogen still exists in the soil that was there last fall. But if you're in the dry part of Alberta, man, you could have a whack of leftover nitrogen. And so don't forget that part of the calculation. And I think most Westerners don't, but from an Ontario perspective, you hear 60 and you hear 3 pounds per bushel and you just go, wow. Actually, it was great. I got asked the question by Mark Davis, what is the nitrogen coefficient for wheat? And what's really interesting is in Western Canada, it's typically 2.25 to 2.5 pounds per bushel. In Ontario, we haven't gone down that pathway. And I think Warren kind of said, I like to keep a wide range. Well, man, we need more pounds per bushel of nitrogen on a heavy clay soil for wheat production than we do on a nice loam soil. And it's just that the heavy clay soil, it has higher organic matter levels, but the biology isn't as active and you don't get as much nitrogen release, and we generally start off close to zero in the spring, so we don't have that residual nitrogen that they have in Western Canada. So oftentimes an 80 bushel crop on heavy clay soil will need 120 pounds of nitrogen. A 100 bushel crop on a nice loam soil will need 120 pounds of nitrogen. So this nitrogen coefficient, I think soil type plays. I think organic matter and soil temperature and the rate of release, or how early in the spring that release starts, plays, and the whole residual nitrogen as well. So there's three factors there that I think you learn to factor into that coefficient that Warren talked about.
All right. Now John is
It's really
getting
interesting.
antsy. So go ahead, Warren, and then we'll make fun of John. I mean, appreciate John, who wants to talk about corn. Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk real quick about that residual nitrogen. It is an important factor, especially coming off of a dry year. The one thing though, because conditions have changed since someone may have soil tested in the fall, right? And one of the other things that we saw happening last fall too is when there was a little bit of moisture, all of a sudden we saw a lot of regrowth happening in those fields, and canola that actually started reflowering. It grew so much, and that used up a lot of nitrogen as well. So if you had soil tested prior to that, you've actually got a lot less to work with there now than you did initially. And as you mentioned, Pete, yeah, that those wet, saturated fields, there is some risk of losses there as well. So in some cases, it may not be worth doing a couple more soil tests this spring just to verify what your levels are.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll John really wants to talk about corn, and we're going to, John. I even have a clip that is all about corn. But Goat Farmer, which is farmer with a PH, which I love, from the Philippines, suggestions on if your fertilizer budget is reduced by 30%. So this is, you've got $100 or $100,000. I don't know what your bill looks like. Let's say it's $1 million. I don't care. If it's reduced by 30%, do you put on full N and sacrifice the P and K? Ouch. Now, I don't know what crop. We can speak in general terms. We can pretend it's canola. We can pretend it's corn. But if you're tightening the belt, where do you sacrifice? Do you take a little off of each, or do you take it all out of the P&K budget? What say you, Peter Johnson?
So you have to start with a soil test. Come on, Lyndsey, I can't believe we haven't said soil test more yet, but like there's no way that you can answer that. And you also need to know what crop. So for example, wheat doesn't respond very much to potash. And so if you have a reasonable potash soil test, and you would normally apply a little to maintain that soil test, but you're growing wheat and you've got to cut your fertilizer budget, well, take it out of the potash. Don't ever take it out of the phosphorus, because wheat loves phosphorus. So does canola as a starter, as Warren said, right? So you can't really short the phosphorus a lot, although in most cases, in fact, in all cases, if you need that nutrient, exactly as they talked about in that first clip, the first increment that you put on earns you the most money. And so with nitrogen, we've typically been at the top end of the curve, and we've often added a little bit of insurance nitrogen. So when you look at the nitrogen application on wheat or corn in Ontario, I can back off 20 pounds and almost lose no yield. I might lose $1 or $2, but I can back off that first 20 pounds and I'm losing less than $10 per acre. Whereas if I back entirely away from my phosphorus and potash starters and I'm on a low soil test, I'm going to give up way more than that few bushels from backing out my nitrogen. So the answer really is know your crop, know the nutrients that it needs to respond to the best, know your soil test, and decide where you take that fertilizer out based on those factors. There is no one answer. I can't just say on all crops take out potash, because you take the potash out of corn and you'll fry yourself.
Warren?
Yeah, I would agree. I was going to say information is power in that situation, right? You have to know, and know your field history, know what your starting levels are. And the other thing to consider too, is it a short-term strategy? Is it a one-off this year? And you can go back to normal again next year. If that's the case, something like, maybe reducing the phosphorus a little bit, as long as you've got, decent amounts in the soil that could be an option rather than sacrifice nitrogen, which is going to do more driving the yield, especially as if we talk about cutting phosphorus back, it's like, yeah, we'll cut it back to maybe 20 pounds instead of 35, 40, or whatever you were going to put on before. And so you're probably not going to sacrifice a lot of yield that way in the short term. But again, that's a very short-term strategy, and you are removing more than you're putting on. So eventually you're going to have to make up for that. That's the one thing to keep in mind.
So put another way though, Warren, so going back to that first discussion of having to broadcast on the canola and harrow it in, obviously we're not putting a pop-up or a starter with that. So looking at this question a different way, if you now have to get the fertility on a completely new way, what's the most important thing to get on there and how? So N and P are probably still going to be your most important, but how in that scenario do you make sure that crop will have enough?
Yeah, and that can get challenging. And if the fields are really that wet that you can't get any fertilizer on, I'd question, do you really want to be seeding it right now? Would be the other thing to think about, because you're not starting off in a good spot. But the broadcast application. So we know when we're broadcasting phosphorus, broadcast higher rates, because you're not going to, you're sacrificing your placement in that situation. So you're going to need a higher rate to make up for that, which can be challenging. And then if we can do some incorporation, so if you broadcast that, then you might have to make, a second pass to broadcast seed, do your incorporation, and you at least have some applied there. And if you got a starting point, with the nitrogen. So as we said, you want to have you need a little bit early on in the season, as Pete was mentioning. And then, we've got that window up until the 6-leaf stage to really get the bulk of it on there. So if it's that wet, I mean, you definitely want to get some on to start with. And we want to, when we're surface applying like that with nitrogen, it's definitely not my number one option. It's not a safe place for it. And we do need to make sure we can get it into the ground somehow, whether through incorporation, which likely isn't going to happen, or through that rainfall event to drive that nitrogen into the soil. So in those situations, I always like to go back to the 4 R's of nutrient management. Your source, your rate, your timing, your placement. We've sacrificed our placement in this case. So what can we do to make up for that? And the thing I like about 4 R's is if you have to cheat a little bit in one spot, you can sometimes make it up for in another spot. And in this case, if we have to cheat on our placement, maybe we can make that up with the source. And rather than just using a urea, which would have been your normal, maybe you use a urease treated urea that's gonna limit some of those volatilization losses. So there's really no one size fits all answer when you start talking about broadcasts, though, and probably the best bet is talk to somebody who's done it and what worked well for them, or what problems did they have, because they're probably gonna have the best advice of anybody.
Absolutely. Okay, so John wants to talk about corn, and we are going to talk about corn. But John, I'm going to tell you, if you have a question, put it in the comments, because we can't read your mind. Like, Pete's good, but he's not that good. So we can shift gears though a little bit, and I do want to. I'm going to play the clip from Greg Stewart because I think it encapsulates a lot of the things we have to. John says 4 R's. That sounded like a couple R's and a few S's. Anyway, yeah, we're cheating a little on some and we're gaining on the other. It's okay. Okay, so this I want to set the scene for this clip because it's pretty great. But it's from 2012, everyone. So you're going to see a Greg Stewart who has perhaps a little darker hair than the last time he was on the show, and maybe a few fewer wrinkles. But don't tell him I said that. But what's also amazing is this video has almost 100,000 views, which it's a good video. Don't get me wrong, but that just kind of blew me away that a video from 10 years ago, and if you look at the comments, there's some that are pretty recent, so people still find it and still look. So clearly starter fertility is still top of mind. We do not have it all figured out. So producer Jay, if we could go to the clip with Greg Stewart, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
So this is the 4th year of a 4-year project to look at starter fertilizer. We originally started out interested in phosphorus placement, liquid versus dry, banded versus broadcast, different arrangements of nitrogen and phosphorus. The interesting thing is that when you look for sites that are relatively low in phosphorus, you also find sites that are relatively low in potash. And the take-home message from the 3 or 4 years that we've been working on this is that if you happen to ignore K levels that have slipped down into the 70, 60, maybe even the 80 range, you can do all sorts of creative things with phosphorus and nitrogen, banding, in furrow, 2x2, broadcast. And if you've missed the fact that your K levels have slipped, you really have missed the mark pretty significantly in terms of maximizing corn yields.
What has been the yield response that you've seen?
So if we're here at Elora, at this site in Elora, that's about a 10 for phosphorus soil test and about a 65 for potash. Because it was that 65 for potash, we broadcast 200 pounds of potash first before we tried any of the starter treatments. And even with the 200 pounds of potash down ahead of planting, the starter treatments that were the clear winners had some potash in them. And to the point that if you compared the control to a treatment that brought maybe 40 pounds of K with them, the difference there could be 15 bushel pretty easy.
Okay. So if I'm a large guy with liquid then, low testing P and K, and broadcast on that P and K, is there any value to doing liquid starter?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we'll use the case study where a grower rents a piece of ground, he gets it soil tested, and he's not great for either P or K. Let's say he's in that same sort of 10 and 70 for phosphorus and potash respectively. Well, our advice for sure would be on a 65 or a 70 soil test K that you'd want to broadcast potash on that. If I'm a liquid guy, big planter, is there value of bringing a liquid that has some additional potash in that? And so far it looks like there is. So 624-6 with a little wee bit of potash in there, or a 220-18 with a little bit more potash, but still we're not talking big amounts of K2O. Has given us a nice bump in yields on those soils that were distinctly depressed from a soil test K. What that number actually is, we're still working on. But it appears that if you broadcast K, that's probably a very important thing to do if you're at a 65 or a 70 soil test K. But it doesn't look like that is enough, that you could still bring a starter fertilizer, even if it was just 624-6 or 220-18, to use a couple of examples. Even if that's all you did extra, that it probably, the little bit of K in the starter actually pays off.
Well, you say the darn word corn and look at the questions. I mean, guys, canola is also amazing, okay? All right, no. Okay, so some of these, though, apply really to corn or canola, which is why we had this little mashup going on. So there you go. Okay, so lots of good questions. Honestly, though, great video from Greg. I also shout out to Mike Cobra, who actually apparently was on the payroll in 2012. I don't know. I think I was on mat leave. So I think that's why he was doing that video. Anyway, I wasn't here yet, is what I'm going with. Okay, so lots of options though, and I think one of the really cool things though is we do focus so much on N and P, but that point about the fact that if the K number is way in the tank, you've got to bring that one up too, which is really interesting, I think, and pretty neat. But lots of questions, so let's get into it. And of course, Kevin, who's out in BC, he can't believe he thinks he heard 10 parts per million of phosphorus. Yes, you did, Kevin. Yes, you did. And he says he's sitting at 200 and trying to pull that down. So, oh my goodness, that's a lot of manure you put on there, sir. Anyway, I'll say that. Okay. All right, so let's go. Let's start with this one, because this one is, yes, it's for corn, but we can apply it to the principles to just about anything. So John says 28% versus urea broadcast. Urea's $40 an acre cheaper. Which is better? Pete, I'll start with you.
A pound of nitrogen is a pound of nitrogen. Have a nice day. And
Oh.
the only difference is how uniformly you can get it applied. And on wheat, winter wheat in particular, how quickly it's available in the spring. And so 28% is half ammonium and half ammonium nitrate, quarter ammonium, and the other half is urea. Urea's got to convert. The nitrate portion is immediately available. So if we put 28 on wheat, then it greens up basically the next day. If we put urea on wheat, especially in the cold early spring, it takes it longer, maybe even 2 weeks. It still gets there, but it just takes it longer. But as far as which is better, man, on wheat, liquid is better. Why is liquid better? It's because of uniformity of application. 7.5-inch rows, and wheat shows everything. On corn, 30-inch rows. The only difference would be that the urea granule is a little bit more subject to volatilization loss because it takes a little bit more water to move it into the soil. And Warren made a good comment, earlier that broadcast that urea and put the urease inhibitor on it if you're putting it on top of wet soil, where that wet soil is just going to fire up the urease enzyme and blow off that as volatility. Now, mind you, you get another half-inch of rain, it washes it into the soil, and then that's not an issue. But with urea, I'm a little more tempted to need the urease inhibitor. But John, at the end of the day, if you can save $40 an acre, man, save the $40 an acre.
All right. Warren, do you want to weigh in on this one?
No, I think Pete nailed it.
Pete's got it. Nailed
Yeah.
it. Well done. John says he was talking about corn, Pete, so stay on topic. Somehow you made it about wheat. Anyway, okay. So now
Of
Jason
course I
Vogt,
did.
of course he did. He's out of Manitoba. Canola is a big potash user. And says they're growing it on sandier soils that are 80 to 100 parts per million for potassium for K. So Warren, now I'm from Manitoba originally. K is not a typical thing that we apply. Saskatchewan likes to export all its potash. It's a roaring trade. But are you seeing potassium potentially being one of the ones that does need to work its way into the fertilizer mix in some situations?
Yeah, certainly, especially on some of those lighter soils, it is a nutrient that we have started seeing, some deficiency symptoms from. It's not by far a really common one, but under certain situations, yeah, it can be a limiting factor. And if that's your most limiting factor, that's what's holding your yield back. So again, it comes back to that soil test as we talked about earlier. You got to know what's in there so you know what you need to add to get that yield target.
Yeah, and potash will leach out of that sand soil and so you get those low soil tests. Whereas on the heavier soils, it just doesn't leach the same. So inherently high is inherently high. The one thing I will say about potash for the growers in Alberta that I find really interesting is that when it's super dry, even with a high potash soil test, a little bit of potash in the starter can actually help the plant overcome a drought-induced potash deficiency. So when it's super dry, it's like we don't get enough moisture around those particles to allow the soil potash to be available. And so that's the one time that you might see a little bit of potash response, even on wheat that doesn't really respond too well to potash. And that to me is bizarre, because you got high soil test potash, and you still end up going potash deficient under those really dry conditions. My last note on that, because I think it absolutely plays, is we haven't talked about tillage. As soon as you go to reduced tillage, you will see more potash deficiency. And way back in 1986, we learned this when I first started with the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. As soon as we went to no-till corn, we saw potash deficiency on soils that we did not see potash deficiency in conventional tillage. And it's all about root exploration and how quickly the roots grow. And so we're all, at least we hope we're all trying to move towards reduced tillage because it's better for soil health. It reduces erosion. But as soon as you do that, man, you got to start looking at maybe you need potash in the starter that you did not need before because of that reduced tillage.
Okay. So now, and yes, tillage is always part of this discussion. And there's a question here about if if we're going to broadcast N, pre-tillage, how much tillage is too much tillage? I am the wrong person to answer this because I have a very biased answer. So, Warren, maybe if you want to take your crack at this first, because I mean, you don't do a ton of tillage there, but in that scenario, if we are trying to work in the nitrogen, how much is too much?
Yeah, so I guess what your goal with that tillage would be to incorporate the nitrogen, right? And we want to get it to a depth where we're not going to see losses. So a really light, shallow tillage is sometimes just as bad as leaving it on the surface because you've got, into that nice moist soil zone, and all of a sudden we can see volatilization losses starting to happen with nothing over top to catch it. So, deeper is better, and I think I know where you're going, and I'm not a huge fan of a lot of excess tillage either. So, I mean, obviously that deep banded nitrogen is the gold standard in my mind. But yeah, if we want to try and incorporate that urea, I guess, what are we using? What's it capable of doing? Is more better? If you can get it deep enough, I guess it is. But there are drawbacks to it too.
Well, and if you're doing it because it was wet, potentially, then deep tillage is, I just envision all sorts of problems. So I suppose now we get to the part of the show where we say it depends.
No,
Yeah.
it's too deep and too wet. It's called mud balls, which turn into footballs that you got to try to plant into, and that simply doesn't work. But Warren, and I see Ray is also saying that placement does impact efficiency, and Ray, you're 100% right. My point was in John's question, given the same placement, a pound of nitrogen is a pound of nitrogen. There's really not very much difference. To Warren's comment, one of the worst things you can do is side dress corn and leave the slot open, even though you put that nitrogen 3 inches deep in the slot. If the slot is open and you're in damp soil, the volatilization losses are through the roof. And so placement is really quite important, Ray. I 100% agree with that. But as if we banned urea 2 inches deep and close the slot, or we ban 28 2 inches deep and close the slot, a pound of nitrogen is a pound of nitrogen.
All right. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but we've hardly talked about foliar. And I want to talk a little bit about what we can do foliar that can potentially help with dealing with what we've had to deal with that spring, right? So thinking about, either Manitoba or Eastern Saskatchewan that are quite behind, or thinking about the super dry conditions in Alberta, or just less than ideal conditions, or the fact that perhaps you're limited by what you can do with a planter and you want to go in later. So specifically, what are some of the best applications for a foliar fertilizer product? So what are some of the things, Pete? I can think of a few off the top of my head where it works well, and then there's other ones that it's just not. So should I be targeting micronutrients through a foliar? Should it just be magnesium? Can I do phosphorus? What can I do with foliar later in the season? Pete, I'll start with you, and then Warren, I'll go to you.
Yeah, so any micronutrient is going to work fairly well as a foliar because we don't need very much of it. And manganese is certainly the gold standard. That's how we fix the problem with manganese. And part of that is because manganese ties up in the soil so quickly that a soil application doesn't work very well. But if you're going to try and solve a phosphorus deficiency with a foliar phosphorus application, it's a macronutrient, and the leaf is not designed to take up that phosphorus. The roots are designed to take up that phosphorus, and so 99% of that phosphorus is going to get washed off the leaf and taken in through the roots anyway. And it's almost impossible with any of the macronutrients to do very much. If you're potash deficient and you put on a foliar potash, you can help a little bit. Like you can gain a bushel or two in soybeans, maybe even 3 or 4, but you're not going to gain the 8 bushels that a soil application would have gained. And just to reiterate what Warren said earlier, if we're going to go to a broadcast fertilizer program, remember that you got to up the rate to get the same response. We typically say it takes 4 times the rate broadcast of phosphorus to equal a band in the soil. And so can we make a difference? Yes, we can, but it takes a lot more. And foliar, it's almost impossible with macronutrients.
All right. Warren, what about boron?
Yeah,
We haven't even talked about boron yet.
and that falls into the micronutrient
Yeah.
category, right? So yes, it can be effective foliarly applied, and the reason it's effective, as Pete mentioned, it's required in small amounts. Yeah, we talk about it in canola a lot because relative to other crops, canola is a high user of boron, but we're still talking about a micronutrient, which means it is fairly small amount. So yeah, in my mind, that's probably the best application method for it when you need it.
Right.
And I think, just to sum it all up, it kind of goes back to what Pete said earlier. A pound of nitrogen is a pound of nitrogen. A pound of phosphorus is a pound of phosphorus. You're not going to get something from nothing, or you can't expect miracles out of some things. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well. And that's kind of why I said earlier, we've kind of got that one shot at seeding to apply our phosphorus and our non-mobile nutrients. And if we miss that window, it's really hard to make that one up.
Yeah. And Lyndsey, just on that note, I really think that from a grower perspective, trying to do things quickly and get things in as fast as they can because of a shortened window, we really need to step back and say, okay, can I run a lower rate of phosphorus with my canola seed, get 90% of the gain that I would have? Like, will 50 or 60% of the phosphorus give me 90% of the gain and speed my field efficiency up that much? Maybe a little less weight in the cart, so I'm not creating quite as much compaction. And can I get away on canola? And Warren, I don't know this. Jason said, canola is a heavy potash user, but can I get away without any potash on my canola crop so that I take that out of the mix because it doesn't respond well? We know on corn, we can't take the potash out of the mix if we need it in the soil. Like we've proven that time and again. Soybeans need both phosphorus and potash, but soybeans will utilize broadcast fertility very well. Corn doesn't use broadcast fertility very well. So these differences in crop and knowing the nutrients that are key to that crop can really help a grower make a better decision in terms of how to do the job quickly and get the most money out of the application.
Yeah,
Warren?
and potash is an interesting one.
Yeah.
So we were talking about the nitrogen coefficient there earlier. I was using 2.83 pounds per bushel. Canola uses a lot of potassium as well. Like we're talking almost as much. We're 2.3 is a number I use, pounds of potassium per bushel of canola. So that's a lot of potassium that the crop is taking up. It's not exporting all of that off the field. A lot of that's being returned to the field. But the other thing with canola, it's got a really healthy root system that's good at scavenging potassium out of the soil. So that's, if we talk about it needs a lot, why don't we see really a lot more applications of potassium in canola is because it's such a good scavenger. And in a lot of cases, our Western Canadian soils are relatively high in it to begin with. So those are two reasons why, I tend to focus more on phosphorus than I do on potassium a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And really great point about what gets cycled back in, right? So just like so if you're not taking the residue off, you're leaving it there, working in whatever, you're just cycling it through the soil. It's not being removed in the grain per se. Now, Warren, what is the panic date on the calendar for seeding? Like, do we have a week?
I don't pick a date. I know we can see good yields as we seed into late May and into early June. It's not, we're not going to necessarily expect the same yield potential as, that mid to early May seeding time frame, but there's still time there to, I'm not pressing the panic button. I'd rather take your time, do it right, rather than have a mess and deal with that for the rest of the year. So I'm not panicking yet. It would be nice to see more activity in the field though.
Yeah, absolutely. Pete, we have one last question from Ivan. What do you think of NH3 in corn?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with anhydrous ammonia in corn as long as you get it in the ground and seal it. And I mean, out west, you use anhydrous all the time in the fall. Put a nitrification inhibitor on with it, and it works really well. It's a good nitrogen source, often cheaper than urea or 28%, but a much higher user toxicity. So that's the downfall. And that's why we're moving away. Like the retails are just moving away from anhydrous because the insurance liability is too high. User safety is just tough.
It's scary stuff. Absolutely. I will always remember in my in the soil fertility class that I took, the video of watching like the can where they put 1 drop of anhydrous ammonia in and it like collapses the can down because it sucks up all the water that's in it and just like, anyway, terrifying. It gave me nightmares, and I'm fearful of anhydrous ammonia. Anyway, it also, the same instructor that taught that class was blind in one eye because of getting anhydrous ammonia in that eye. So I learned my lesson and run screaming away from it every time. Anyway, so there you go. So maybe not. It is still used, but it definitely is not as popular as it used to be. So we are out of time. Ray and John both want to wish Sean a happy birthday. Ray got it right this time. Well done, Ray DeBenko. So there you go, us May babies. So I would like to point out to everyone, if you haven't done the math yet, I am 2 weeks older. And so he has to listen to me. Okay, so also, so thank you to Warren and to Peter. Anyone watching the show, if we didn't get to your question, if we didn't answer your question, you can zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com. I can get in touch with both of these gents if you don't have their emails directly, and we can get you that answer for sure. And as always, if you've got some ideas of topics or people you would like to see on the show, do let me know. All right, Warren, I do hope you get out to the field soon.
Thank you kindly.
Yes. All right. And Pete, thank you for all your hard work at Real Ag today. This was a big one.
Sean said on the radio show that there's a lot of peat today. Oh gosh, a lot of peat today.
I like it, but you can tell it rained because Peter had time to do all this. So there you go. So Pete, I do hope the wheat crop just continues to look fantastic, and you'll be back on in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk. I am volunteering you for this. We are going to talk about fusarium head blight control in a couple of weeks. All right. And as always, big thank you to our show sponsor, Adama Canada, and please head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist to sign up for those CEU credits. Next week is the holiday Monday, so we will not have a show. We're going to take the day, but we will be back the week after, and I think we'll be talking about corn and soybean emergence and establishment and doing an assessment on just how well you did on that planting pass. All right. And Gord, Spexander's got even a dig on another topic. I love it. Keep them coming. All right. Cheers, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks.